Well, tēnā koe, colleague. It's a pleasure to introduce you to Professor Welby Ings, who's probably well known by almost all of you in the university. Welby first started at AUT in 1997 and has an extensive history with AUT, including the supervision of 50 PhD students, 30 PhD students and 56 masterate students, of which about 80% of them have been with Format 3. So a massive amount of experience in this particular format, the subject of today's presentation. It's a pleasure to hand you over to Professor Welby Ings to talk through use of Format 3 in supervision.
Kia ora, everyone. What I thought, we've got 10 minutes. So I thought what I'd do is try and condense this into 10 minutes. That's an easy way of getting your head round and answering the question, if I had a candidate came to me and they were thinking of a Format 3, what might that involve? So basically, Format 3, as we call it today, AUT was a very early adopter of this. And it's been closely associated with universities that have got a base in the professions. So let me show you basically the structure. It differs from other theses in that it normally has two parts. It has an exegesis, which is a body of written work, and then it has a piece of practice. So the format is distinguished by having two parts in it. The interesting thing about the practice is that is the primary site of the research. So that is the place where the research all happens. And the exegesis is the piece that explains it. So from exegesis, it's a term we borrowed from theology, meaning to explain. So there's a body of practical work. If you look at our handbook, the body of practical work forms the primary site of the inquiry. We don't put a percentage on it. Back in the day, we used to go kind of like 80% and 20% writing. But now we understand that in different studies, it differs slightly. Okay, so what could be Format 3? Well, here's some examples of things that have been Format 3 studies. Exhibitions, where somebody's answering the question with an exhibition of work. Somebody designs a new form of car that runs on water, not for a master's. It might be a novel, a screenplay, or collection, like a collection of short stories or of poetry. Could be a film or animation, a performance, so that can go everything from dance, theatre, music. Musical compositions have been submitted in the past, portfolios, video games, a campaign or community initiative that someone's working with a community to solve a problem, a collection of resources, or something which is got change. Like, let's say you're in a hospital working as a nurse and you're bringing in a series of changes, or you're a manager who's bringing in a series of changes over time, and you are looking at the effectiveness of those and then recording how that happens. Or it might be a client education video. So all of those have been submitted in the past in one form or another. But of course it's open to other research too. So the exegesis. At AUT, in a master's, an exegesis is normally between 7,000 to 15,000 words. In a PhD, it's between 40,000 to 50,000 words. What does it have in it? Well, it actually is very close to what you would expect from any research study. So it will have an explanatory introduction. Then there will be the standard review of literature, except sometimes in Format 3 we call that a review of knowledge. In other words, that's where you're positioning your research study in relation to what's already existing. So there's a review of literature or a review of knowledge. And then, because it's a research question, you have to be able to, the candidate needs to discuss the research design or methodology to answer the question for an examiner, is this the most effective way of answering this question? Is this the most effective methodology for answering this question? And then it's more flexible in these other things, but it normally has some kind of discussion of the work in terms of its theoretical or historical or critical context. Often you'll see, if you have a look online at existing Format 3 studies, it's called a critical commentary. And then there's a conclusion and reflection. So that's a kind of a very generic description of the skeleton of an exegesis, but it can vary. Okay, so maybe the easy way to do this is to look at some examples of it and see how these play out. So here's an example from, this has come from business. So this is Mike Hutchison. It was a master's done as an MPhil in 2015. So the book you're seeing there, that is his exegesis. Because his exegesis, he wanted to be certain that it would also be able to speak to the business world. So he had to speak into two worlds, to the academy and also to the profession. So occasionally you'll see that the exegeses are, a very traditional academic looking one, and sometimes they're formatted because the study being professional is having to speak and have relevance in two zones. The little USB thing there you see is are his podcasts, his vodcasts, that the examiner can plug in and watch. So there's the practical work on that side, and then there's the exegesis on the other. So if we have a look at that, the question he's answering can only be answered by practice. So this is the big one. The question that the candidate asks has to be something that can be only answered if they conduct practice. So he goes, how might I design in documentary and vodcast form some texts that effectively communicate to business and education sector audiences the nature and importance of fostering creativity in New Zealand business. So his question was, how do we get across to people who may be just entering business, what does creativity look like and how do we foster it? So if you have a look, this is just a wee example from one. So he designed about 4 vodcasts, and he also, that were able to be loaded onto YouTube, that are quick, like 3-minute looks. But then there's a broader documentary. So as a piece of work, this is an example.
Hi, I'm Mike Hutchison, and this is a Paradox Vodcast. Today I want to talk about creativity in business. Peter Drucker, the management and innovation guru, said that business has only 2 functions, marketing and innovation. Everything else is a cost. I agree with Drucker.
So, we're jumping out of that quickly because it goes on for much longer. So basically you'll see that the practice has got to be of a very high professional standard. It's not, these format 3s are not easy outs when someone goes, I think I'm going to be a novelist and I'm going to do a novel and I've never written a novel before in my life. This is something where people bring with them a backpack full of advanced practice, and they're using practice in the scholarly domain. So here's another example from masters. And this is an interesting one. So this is somebody who actually brought with them, although they're a designer, they brought with them a long history of being a musician. So the question that she asks is, how might one design an accessible alternative system of musical notation that communicates the location of musical sounds, intervals, duration, timbre, and volume? So what we see on the other side of the screen here is what she said people get confronted with and they have trouble with it. So she said, could I as a designer and a musician design something that is much more accessible? So she designed a system and then she applied it to 3 different periods in music. So here is an example of it where it is used for a piece of more contemporary work. One of the big advantages of these practice-oriented research projects is that they often get very high currency in the professional world that we support. So work like that won huge awards in the New Zealand Design Awards. So those first 2 were examples of masters. Now let's have a look at a couple of PhDs. So again, it will be driven by a question. So here's an example from Dr. Tatiana Tavares, where she is designing a new kind of novel And she's driven by three questions. How could augmented reality, that's involving film, illustration, animation, sound, and app design, be used to make an interactive digital narrative? Okay, so how could I make a novel that's going to combine all those things and actually work inside augmented reality? And the second part is, how could the interaction between the story parts be used to explore a story that looked at the line between what is real and what is not real? And she constructs that inside a Brazilian concept which comes close to our idea of magical realism. So she's creating a magical realist novel. And the last one is that she's looking at the concept of polyvocal, which is where you have more than one person telling the story in an AR picture book. So this is hard, and that's what a PhD is supposed to be doing. It's setting a very difficult question, but you could only answer this by making the piece of work. So this has got a body of practice and an exegesis. Here's the body of practice. Here's just a short description of it.
Euclides was destined to be a martyr.
So by pressing the
Euclides
button,
and Elsa
you
were
hear
young
a different narrator
and full
telling
of
the same
ideas.
story.
Euclides and Elsa
But
were
they all
young
have a
and
bias.
fighters for freedom. His photograph shattered on the floor.
I would like to tell you a story of faith.
There is original sin, and God never forgets.
There is good and evil in this world. Both are necessary.
So the same novel told by a compassionate narrator, an orthodox conservative, and a pragmatist. But the novel changes depending on which person, even though you're looking at the same pictures, you hold your device over, and depending who you ask to tell you the story, they will tell you it with a different value system on it. So, often in areas in the practice-led research, the methods, they will often involve field journals, they'll have archive research, and they generally have some kind of iterative development. That is when you're trying stuff out and adjusting and trying to get it better. And so that doesn't matter whether it's on a ward and you're trying some system to see if you can get a better environment for a patient, or you're in an organization and you're trying something. So it's not just making an artifact. You are researching and trying and reflecting and refining until you get to something. So the methods in these often have a lot to do with iterations of stuff. So, and getting feedback and then getting the artifact or the system more and more refined until you get it to a stage where you think it's answering the question. So so this is the last example we're just going to discuss. So this is Tim Hagen. So here's somebody who's using a new approach to designing podcasts. So the theoretical world he's looking at is the concept of the podcast and innovations and commentary on podcasts. Because it's a PhD, just as the one beforehand, you are expected in the practice to bring new knowledge forward. So it's not just a synthesis and application of what exists. You're expected to bring something new. So he's bringing a new form, designing a new form of podcasting. He has a professional background. So one of the things that we've found really useful, irrespective of the field, that when people apply to do one of these, they're expected to put a portfolio or CV in that shows that they have the equivalent background in the area that they're doing the practice as somebody who has spent 3 years doing an undergrad degree and 2 years doing a master. So that's why, as I said, it's been very well tailored for our scholarly communities that have lived outside of the academy and they come into the university to do a project. So here's somebody who'd been a designer in New York, who's a very successful writer, and he designs a new form of podcast. So the podcasts are new, but his portfolio showed his ability. So the question he's asking is, what is the potential of podcasting to shape an episodic autobiographical narrative as a means of expanding dialogues about mental health and addiction issues among 17 to 25-year-old audiences? So there's a target, and he's going, could you design a particular form of podcast that would work effectively to address this question? So just a couple of things to reiterate. It's really important to make sure that the person coming in with a practice-led project has substantial background in that practice. You can't walk in and suddenly be, an accomplished novelist and use that, assume that you're going to make your first novel is going to be equivalent to someone who's an accomplished novelist. So one of the things that he did that was very interesting is that his podcasts, because they're played on mobile devices, actually have got visual components to them. So that, and a few things that we found really helpful in helping people think through is think about the budget and scale of this. The period of time you've got, if it's a master, it's probably around about 10 months. If it's a PhD, 3 to 4 years. How much is this going to cost? What is the scale? Because it's not a Nobel Peace Prize. It's a thesis. We think about examination format. Is this going to be an installation where examiners are going to have to come into the university, or is this something which is going to go out? And one of the things we found really useful is, fortunately, because of tūwhera at this university, we can refer candidates on to existing projects to go, well, here's how this person handled it, and this is how this person handled it. So that, just very quickly, so here's a title sequence he's developing for episode 1. So this isn't the audio part, this is just the piece that he develops at the very beginning of it. So this is all his work. So he's using film, he's using design, he's using sound. A new knowledge, it's a new form of podcasting that he's bringing into the world. Podcast series is called Spilled Ink. So let's summarize this. If you've got a candidate working in format 3, it is practice-led. So the primary site of the research is in the practice. So the question is something that can only be answered by practice. The exegesis, which is the supporting document, will always have a review of knowledge and a discussion of the methodological approach. And then it will have some kind of critical commentary on the work, but that can vary. If someone is applying, we always make sure that we have seen evidence of existing and established ability in the practice. Really helpful thing that we find with candidates is to get them to look at examples. And because this university has been and has had things like tūwhera, which is this more open access, it means that you can direct them to stuff. And if you're not sure, just ask. It's a very generous community, this. We're interested in trying to make education really relevant for people. So there are lots of good examples. And discuss with them very carefully the planning of the project, so they're not trying to design the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in 10 months. So scale, cost, and time. So this hopefully that's a bit of help in clarifying. But if you're not sure, ask. We've got expertise right across the university. We're proud of this. We're one of the leading universities in this form of research, and so we've got accrued stuff and we've got goodwill there. And I hope that that's helpful. Kia kaha. Thank you.